Okay, we are on Gimel Amud Aleph. We are about 6 lines down. So we're going through a number of statements of Rabbi Yirmiyah, or perhaps it's Rabbi Chia bar Abba. So we mentioned a couple yesterday, and we said we were saying that the Nevi'im created the Sophites, and we ended up by concluding that the Sophites had been there all along, except people had forgotten their proper use, and then Nevi'im came along and reestablished it. So we'll use that same theme with another statement of Rabbi Yirmiyah. V'amar Rabbi Yirmiyah v'itema Rabbi Chia bar Abba Tirgum shel Torah unkulus hager amaro mipi Rabbi Eliezer Rabbi Yoshua, that the Tirgum of the Torah, which we know as being unkulus, was he documented it based on the statements of Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Yoshua. And Tirgum shel Nevi'im Yonatan ben Uziel amaro mipri Chagai Zechariah Malachi. And the Tirgum of Nevi'im was written by Yonatan ben Uziel, that he heard from the last prophets, Chagai Zechariah Malachi, V'nizdaza Eretzel Arbamot Parsa, and the land of Israel shook 400 Parsa by 400 Parsa. That's a euphemism that like it was some sort of shock as a result of something tremendous that took place. We've seen that expression before. Yatztabat kol vamra mihu zeh shegilel gila sitrai livnei adam. And a voice was heard saying, who is it that revealed my secrets to everyone? Amad Yonatan ben Uziel raglav amar ani hu shegiliti sitrecha livnei adam. And Yonatan ben Uziel stood up and said that he had done that. Galui biyadu lefanecha shelo lichvodi asiti v'lo lichvod BAYT Abba ela lichvodcha asiti shelo yarbu machloket b'Yisrael. And he said, furthermore, it wasn't for my honor. I guess they didn't have like royalties back then like we have now. He says it wasn't for his honor or his household's honor. It was for God's honor that people should understand Nevi'im properly, and therefore there shouldn't be disagreements as to what the text means. V'od bikesh legalot tirgum shel ktuvim, and he further wanted to go on and translate into Aramaic ktuvim as well. Yatztabat kol v'amralo dayecha, and a heavenly voice told him to not pursue it, that he had done enough already. So the Gemara asks, Maitama, why wasn't he allowed to continue? Mishum de'it BAYT Mashiach. Because in Ktuvim there's hints as to the Messianic era, and he would have revealed them, so they weren't revealable. So the Gemara now goes back a second. Obviously we're getting on a tangent and further away from what we were discussing. But we'll get back to the theme from yesterday, as I promised. V'tirgum shel Torah unkulus hager amro. How is it that you're saying that Unkulus was the author of the Tirgum that we're familiar with on Chumash? Veha marav Ika baravina marav Chananel amarav. We have a statement on the following pasuk. It says, "Ma'dichdi vayikaru b'sefer Torah Elokim meforash v'sum sechel v'yavinu b'mikra." So it says, this pasuk is coming from Nehemiah. It says they read the scroll of Hashem's Torah clearly with the application of wisdom. They clarified through the reading. So now we're going to dissect the pasuk. Vayikaru b'sefer Torah Elokim. They read in the Torah of God. Ze mikra. So that's the text. Miforash, explained or elucidated. Ze targum. That means they read the translation Aramaic, because obviously at the time of Nehemiah they would have been in Bavel at that point still. Visum shechel elu hapsukim. And when it says Visum sechel, through wisdom, that means the pisuk, meaning the punctuation between the verses, like knowing what is a comma or a sof pasuk. V'avinu b'mikra ele piskei tamim. And when it says, and they clarified the text, that means the notes. So, the notes also give you a sense of also commas and everything else.
It looks like they are taking down a little from Enkelos.
Yeah, so that's what he's going to ask. V'amri la elu masoret. Some say that what it is the masoret, like how we have a kriyuch tiv, right? So to know those differences. So what's clear from this story is that they must have had a Targum right back at the time of Nehemiah, because it says that they were looking at the Targum. And yet Onkelos Ager was many, many centuries after Nehemiah. He wasn't at the time of the Bible, so it must be that the Targum existed. So how can you say that he's the author when we're saying that they're looking at it in right at the beginning of BAYT Sheni? So he answers like we did yesterday, Shechachum v'chazru v'yisidum, is that somehow it's not like today where it's on everybody's iPod. The Targum somehow got lost or garbled over the years. And so Onkelos had to redo it or restore it. So although he lived in a later age, he was known for having put the Targum together. So now the Gemara says, Maishna doraita delo izdaza, navi izdaza. I don't understand. There didn't seem to be any reaction from Shamayim for the fact that the Torah was translated, and yet we see that there was a violent reaction to the fact that Nevi'im were translated. So what's the difference? So the Gemara answers, Doraita mifarsha milte de Nevi ikimile de mifarshan vikimile de mistaman. So he says the Torah is relatively easy to understand and to translate because things are clear. But in Nevi'im, there are some things that are clear and some things that are not clear, and therefore the Targum revealed things that weren't clear, that weren't obvious, that were chidushim, that the average person wouldn't have been able to ever figure out. So the Gemara now goes on to give an example. Dichtiv, so this pasuk is in Zechariah, right at the very end of Zechariah. So this is discussing, this isn't well known, but at the time of Mashiach there'll be two Mashiachs. One is Mashiach ben Yosef, who will die and in battle, I guess, and then there's Mashiach ben David, who will survive. So he said, the Navi said, Bayomahu Yigdal misped Yerushalayim kimisped Hadad Rimon bebikat Megidon. So he says on that day there'll be such a great mourning in Jerusalem over Mashiach ben Yosef that dies, like the mourning of Hadad Rimon in the valley of Megidon. So we have a couple of problems here. First of all, we've never heard of anybody in Tanakh called Hadad Rimon, and second of all, we're not familiar with the place in Israel called Bikat Megidon either. So what's the Navi talking about? So he's saying the Targum explains that there's two events that the Navi is referring to, and therefore that's what we mean, that there are things in Nevi'im that are hidden from us that without the Targum we would have no clear understanding. So that's how he explains it now. V'amarav Yosef ilmalet tirguma dahaikra lo yadana mai kamar. If not for the Tirgum, I wouldn't have any idea what the Navi's talking about. So he means, so here's the Targum. The Targum cuts the verse into two and translates like the following. Biyoma hahu, on that day, Yaske mispada b'Yerushalayim, there'll be a great mourning in Jerusalem. So far so good, right? Kemispada de Achav bar Omri de Katalyate Hadad Rimon ben Tavrimon, like the mourning over Achav. Achav was king of Israel, who was killed by Hadad Rimon, the son of Tavrimon. That occurred in Ramot Gilad, and that's spoken about in the end of the first book of Kings. Is the death of Achav. So that's one event that he's referring to. Ukespeda kemispeda de Yoshia baramon de Katalyate Paro Chagira bebigat Megiddo. And like the Hesped for Yoshia Baramon, who was the king of Yehuda, who was killed by, that's interesting, they translate into Aramaic, Paro Chagira. We know him as Paro Necho, right? Paro the lame. In the valley of Megiddo. We know that we saw just a couple of weeks ago in DAF Yomi that Yoshiyahu was told by the prophet to stay out of it, but Egypt, Paro Necho, came through the land of Israel to fight the king of Babylon, and Yoshiyahu was either aligned with Bavel and didn't want him to go out to war, or he didn't want them fighting in Israel so that Israel would be destroyed while the two of them were having it out. So the prophet told him to stay away, and he didn't listen, and the Egyptian soldiers caught him and put him up and shot 300 arrows into him. So
there's also something that says that no army is supposed to.
Yeah, he was darshan the pasuk that no army will come through you. So he tried to stop them, and as a result, he died. And he was the most righteous of kings. We read in the Haftorahs how he reestablished the Korban Pesach and the Beit HaMikdash and a whole bunch of other things. So it was a very tragic event. So that shows you that that if it weren't for the Targum, we would have no clue what's being referred to in the pasuk. And so now, since we mentioned Rav Yirmiyah, we mention another one of his teachings. Ra'iti ani Daniel levadi et hamareh v'anashim asher hayu imi lo ru et hamareh. Aval charada gdola nafla lehem vayivrechu behechaveh. So Daniel said, I saw the vision, and the people that were with me didn't see the vision, but a great trembling came upon them, and they ran away and hid. So the Gemara says, Man ninu anashim, who are the people that were there that he saw the vision, they didn't see the vision. Amar Rav Yirmiyah v'Temar Rabbi Chia bar Abba zeh Chagai Zechariah Malachi. The last prophets were there, but they did not see it. So the Gemara says, in way of passing, Inu adifu minei v'iyu adif minayu. They were more worthy than him, and he was more worthy than them. So the Gemara explains, Inu adifu minei, Inu navi v'iyu lav navi. They were more worthy in the sense that they were Nevi'im and Daniel was not a Navi. Iyu adif minayu di iyu chazavinu lo chazav. And he was more worthy in that he saw this vision and they, for some reason, could not see it. So the Gemara says, V'vchi me'achar de lo chazu ma'itama avitu. So the Gemara asks the obvious question, if they didn't see the vision that Daniel saw that terrified him, so why were they afraid if they didn't see it? So he says, Afal gav de'inu lo chazu mazlayu chazu. So I don't know how exactly to explain this, but Rashi says that when we say a person's mazal, like that's an expression we use all the time, there's some sort of heavenly double that a person has that is their angel, their guardian angel. Yeah, we call it guardian angel. So their guardian angel witnessed it, and as a result, the guardian angel has a subliminal effect on the person. So the person felt very restless, very terrified, without having any recognition as to what it was. But they had, like we call it today, they had some sort of premonition that something bad was about to happen, even though they didn't see anything. But because their mazal in heaven knew about it and was feeling terrible, so then made them feel terrible. Okay, we call it today someone's natural instinct or premonition, or we say that somebody might be psychic, so that's what they're saying. They had an inclination that something bad was about to happen, so that's why they fled. Amar Ravina, so Ravina says, as a result, if that's the case, Shmamina Haiman de Mivit Afagav Deyu Lo Chazu Mazle Chazu, that if somebody just wakes up in the morning one day and they feel like something terrible is going to happen, it's because their mazal is suggesting to them subliminally that something wrong is about to happen. So my takante, so then what do you do when that happens? So he says, Likre Kriyat Shema. He says you should read Kriyat Shema. So he gives you three solutions. One is to read Kriyat Shema. And if you're in a place where you can't say Kriyat Shema because it's filthy or something, then you should move to another place that's 4 garmide away, like jump away to another place. We say in Hebrew, Mishaneh Makom Mishaneh Mazal, right? Yeah. So that's literally what it means. V'i lo, and if that he can't do either of those things, then Lema Hacha Iza de Beitav Chashmene Minai. So that's funny. He should say the goat in the kitchen is a lot fatter than I am, right? That's found its way into the fairy tales also, right? So he's essentially saying, there's better game out there than I am. So leave me out of it. Okay, so now the Gemara gets back on topic a little. So we go back to the pasuk that we mentioned yesterday. We said that we learned from Midinam Dina V'ir V'ir. We were learning to know that there are separate times for reading the Megillah in a walled city or an unwalled city, or in Shushan and other walled cities at the time that were not walled cities at the time of Yoshua, and Shushan itself, which was, we said, the exception. So, but if you read the pasuk to the end, there's another expression in that pasuk. It says, Mishpacha u'mishpacha medinam dina v'ir v'ir. So how does the mishpacha u'mishpacha come into it, right? If we're already learning a drasha for all those other expressions, then why do we not learn a drasha for that? So he says, "V'ashtam damar dinam dinav yivir ledrash mishpacha mishpacha lamayata." So what does that come to teach you? So Amar Rabbi Yossi Bar Chanina lavi mishpachot kuna leviyah shemivatlin avodatan ubayin lishmo mikra Megillah. It's to tell you that even the Kohanim and the Leviim should set aside the avodah and come to hear the Megillah. That's more important. Now remember that Megillat Esther took place between BAYT Rishon and BAYT Sheni. So during BAYT Sheni period, they celebrated it during the time of the Beit HaMikdash. So he's telling you that the service in the Beit HaMikdash is deferred in order to hear the Megillah. Tamarav Yuda Marav Konim Bavodatan Levim Beduchanan Visel B'Mabanan. We just learnt all this Masachet Tanit a second ago. We said that they would go in groups and shifts to Yerushalayim. So the Kohanim would be doing the avodah, and the Levim would do the singing, and the Yisraelim would be part of the Maimed. We said that would either pray or learn or do something while the avodah was going on. Kulam nevatlin avodatan ubayim lishmo mikra Megillah. Everybody sets down what they're doing and comes to the Megillah reading. Tanya nami hachi. We learned similarly. Konim avodatan levin yuchanam yisabemad avodan kulam nevatlin avodatan bayim lishmo mikra Megillah. So once again, the same learning. Mikan samchu shel BAYT Rebbe. So from here we learnt from BAYT Rebbe shemivatlin Talmud Torah ubaim lishma mikra Megillah kal v'chomer. So the members of the household of the scholars of the household of Rebbe relied on this ruling to suggest that you set aside Talmud Torah also to come to hear the Megillah. Kal v'chomer me'avoda, because they made the following kal v'chomer ma'avoda shi chamura. The avodah is far more chamur than Talmud Torah. The Gemara will discuss this in a minute, like whether that's true or not. So mivatlin nan, and we would set that aside for Mikra Megillah. Talmud Torah lo koshken, so all the more so Torah study. So the Gemara pushes back right away. Avoda chamura mi Talmud Torah. Where do you get the assumption that the avoda is more severe than Talmud Torah? V'achtiv v'hi biot Yoshua b'Yericho v'Yisayna v'yar v'nei ish omed l'negdo. We read this in the Haftorah that Yoshua was in Yericho and he saw a man who was against him. V'yishtachu la'apav, and he bowed down to him. How did he bow down to him? V'amar Rav Yoshua ben Levi, asur l'adam shiten shalom l'chaviro b'layla chayshinan shema shedhu. This took place at night, of course. So we say, why would he have bowed down to him? He could have been a demon. So shani hatam damar le ki ani sar Hashem sar tzva Hashem, because the angel introduced himself. Because Yoshua challenged him and said, "Who are you? Are you for us or against us?" And he said, "I'm an angel of God. I've come to speak to you." So he had introduced himself as an angel, so he bowed down to him. So the Gemara asked the obvious question, Dilma min Shakre. So what, the guy was going to tell him I'm the enemy so that he could shoot him? Maybe he was lying, right? And maybe he was a demon or some other creature. So it says, Gmiri de lo mafki shem shemaim lebatala. Even the Shadim have a code of conduct that they observe, and saying God's name is something that they refrain from doing, or maybe they're not capable of doing. So therefore he knew that it wasn't a demon because the demon couldn't say Shem Hashem. So Amar lo emesh. So what did the Malach tell him? Because he had a message for him. He said, Amar lo emesh bitaltem tamid shel ben arba'im v'achshav bitaltem Talmud Torah. So this was at the time of war, and the angel objected that they had not performed the tamid shel ben arba'im, and now it's nighttime and they're not learning. So he was upset at him. So Amar lo al eze mehen bata. So he asked him, so which one are you coming to punish me for? Amar lo ata bati. He says, now I've come. So he understood that the Talmud Torah one was more severe. Miyad vayalen Yoshua b'laylahu b'toch ha'emek. It says that Yoshua lodged or slept that night in the valley. But it doesn't mean literally slept. Amar Rabbi Yochanan melamed shelan be'omka shel halacha. It means lan, or lodged, in the sense that he opened his books and started to study. But in any event, we see that Talmud Torah is greater because that's the one that the angel came to punish him over, right? Ve'amar Rav Shmuel bar Unya gadol Talmud Torah yoter mi'akravat t'midim shne'emar ata bati. So, like we just said, so you see that the Talmud Torah was greater than the Avodah. So how do you make your kal v'chomer? So he answers him, it depends. Lo kashya hadi rabim v'hadi yachid. That in the story with Yoshua was the Torah study of many, of everybody. So therefore, clearly that was more important than the Avodah. But in the where the scholars of Rebbe were talking about, that's talking about the Talmud Torah of an individual. So an individual should set aside his Torah study for Mikra Megillah, because certainly it's not on the same madrega of the avoda, which we saw is postponed. But the Gemara once again is going to push back on that. Udiachid kal. You're saying that an individual's Talmud Torah is less important than the avoda, but we have the following with reference to signs of mourning in specific days in the Jewish calendar. Vatnan nashim b'moed me'anot avalo metapchot. We say that women on Chol HaMoed can sing songs, but they can't beat their chests in terms of at a funeral. And Rabbi Yishmael Omer, imayu smuchot lamita metapchot. And Rabbi Yishmael says if they were right beside the funeral bier, that they can beat their breasts. Berashei chodashim b'Chanukah b'Purim. So these are days we say Hallel. Me'anot u'metapchot b'zeh u'b'zeh aval lo mekoninot. We say they can sing dirges and beat their chests, but they can't do the responsive wailing. Today you'll hear it amongst Middle Eastern women. They have that sound that they make. Mar Rababar Huna and Moed Bipnei Talmid Chacham, that if it were a Talmid Chacham that was on his funeral, then everything goes. You're allowed even this wailing. Kol sheken Chanukah Purim that are only derabanan, right? So you see that we're willing to postpone the Isser of mourning Mishuma Talmid Chacham. So it shows you that Torah study is more important than a whole bunch of other things. So the Gemara says, no, you're mixing two concepts here. Kvod Torah kamart. This is talking about the honor of Torah. Kvod Torah diyachid chamur. Talmud Torah diyachid kal. Clearly the honor of a Torah scholar is more prevalent. But when it comes to the learning of an individual Torah scholar, then that could be set aside to go hear the Megillah, and that would be considered to be more important. Okay, so now the Gemara is going to just build off of a few of the observations that we just made, and finally end up asking a question about a couple of comparisons that we haven't made yet. So the Gemara just goes back and summarizes. Amar Rava Pshita li avoda mikra Megillah mikra Megillah adif. From what we've been saying, that if your choices are in terms of doing a mitzvah between doing the avoda and reading the Megillah, then the reading the Megillah is more important. Mid Rabbi Yossi Bar Chanina, from what he just explained. And Talmud Torah mikra Megillah adif mides samcho shel BAYT Rebbe. And if you have a choice between Talmud Torah and hearing the Megillah, then once again the Megillah would be important, as we just saw from the scholars from Rebbe's house. Talmud Torah met mitzvah adif. And if your choices are between learning and taking care of a met mitzvah, then obviously the met mitzvah is more important. As we've learned, midatanya mevatlin Talmud Torah lotzat met ulachnasat kala. So, as we've learnt, that you set aside Torah study for the purposes of a burial, or to put together the needs for a kala that's getting married. And avodah umet mitzvah adif mi v'lachoto. And if you have a choice between performing the avoda and taking care of a met mitzvah, once again the met mitzvah is more important, from the word milachoto. Now this has to do with a nazir. It says al nefesh met lo yavo. It says that a nazir is not allowed to come in contact with any dead body. And then it goes on to say laviv ulimo lachiv lachoto lo itamalem b'motam. And then it tells you that for direct members of his family, his mother, his father, his brother, his sister, he's not allowed to come in contact with them either to become Tameh. But you just said that he's not allowed to come in contact with any person, any dead person. So why would you then need to specify these people? You've already told me that under no circumstances is he allowed to come in contact with the dead person. So then what difference would it make if it's a direct family member or not a direct family member? We've just told you not come in contact with the dead person. So the Gemara goes through a set of limudim, and we're going to see here on Velachoto that it essentially says that it just means these people and a normal dead person that you can't come in contact with. But if it's a met mitzvah who we know is someone that doesn't have anybody to bury him or her, then he should take care of them. So Detanya Bilachoto, his sister, Matamud Lomar, what is it coming to tell you? Now we've seen this Gemara many times, a very famous Gemara. Okay, we saw it in Brachot, it's in Nazir, it's in other places too. I don't think this is a complete list of where this Gemara comes. I'm pretty sure it's in Psachim as well. Is it? Yeah. So he says, now it's interesting that they give these examples. So he says somebody was on his way to shech the Korban Pesach, or to circumcise his son. Now these are the only two mitzvot aseh that carry the penalty of karet if you don't perform them. Okay, there's no karet by mitzvah taseh by definition, except for these two. If you neglect to do the Korban Pesach, or you neglect to circumcise yourself, or in this case a baby. V'shama shemet lo met, and he heard that someone died. Yachol yitama, you would think that he should go back and take care of them. Amart lo yitama. So then you say, no, he should not take care of them. Yachol kashem sheino mitameh lachoto, kach eino mitameh lamet mitzvah. So you might think that just as this is talking this is anyone, not necessarily a Nazir or a Kohen Gadol or somebody who's not allowed to come in contact with the dead person. You would think that he should not become Tameh, as he's not allowed to become Tameh for his sister. Now we're talking about the Nazir. Kach eino mitameh lemet mitzvah, he shouldn't become Tameh for met mitzvah either. Tamud Mumar v'lachoto. The Torah specifically said sister, lachoto eino mitameh ava mitameh lemet mitzvah. So it's only direct relatives that the Torah then went on to expressly forbid them, aside from the fact they told you everybody. So therefore, if the Torah has already told you everybody, now he's giving you a specific person, so then that means it's the specific person you should be wary of. But if it's a met mitzvah and there's no one to take care of that met, that you should therefore become tameh for the met mitzvah. So then clearly, if your choices are between Talmud Torah and a met mitzvah, the met mitzvah is more important, because as we see, even a Nazir or a Kohen Gadol can take care of a met mitzvah. Okay, so here's his problem. Now that we've laid out all of those obvious ones, he says, Bai Rava, Mikra Megillah umet mitzvah he minayim adif. So we saw that Mikra Megillah was important, and we saw that met mitzvah was important. So which one of the two of them is important? So Mikra Megillah adif mishum pirsum nesa. Is it Mikra Megillah because by hearing the Megillah it's all part of the pirsum nesa which we're trying to encourage? Or Dilma met mitzvah adif mishrim kvod abriot. Or maybe the met mitzvah is more important because of basic human dignity. So Batar Debai Hadar Pashta, after he asked the question, he thought about it and he said it's really quite simple. Met mitzvah dif damar mar gadol kvod abriut shedochet lo taseh shebatorah. That we know that we have a general statement that the human dignity is an important principle because it's doche alota seba Torah. In other words, well, here's one of them. We say that a Nazir or a Kohen Gadol should take care of a mitzvah, but we also know that, for example, on Shabbat, people are allowed to carry stones with them to take to the outhouse, even though they had to carry them, or it could be outside the tchum because they had to go to the bathroom somewhere, right? So we know that as a result, we waive certain restrictions because people have basic needs that need to be tended to. Gufa. So now we go back to the thing that we talked about at the end of yesterday, which I suggested was receiving a lot of focus today because it's trying to define what is considered part of a walled city. What about adjacent places to the walled city? So we talked about in Yerushalayim, which neighborhoods of Yerushalayim today are considered Yerushalayim for the purpose of Shushan Purim, right? So I remember when I studied there in the 70s, like everything that was in the Shetach HaYiriyah of Yerushalayim was considered Yerushalayim. But today you have Har Nof, and you have Givat Ze'ev, and you have Ma'ale Adumim, and you have Gilo, and you have Neve Yaakov, and Ramot, and all these neighborhoods that have spread out that really don't see the old city, right? Or the old city can't see them. So are they adjacent or within view of the old city, right?
It's not part of Yerushalayim.
I know, it's outside of Yerushalayim.
No, it's not even part of
Yeah, it's outside. Givat Ze'ev and Ma'ale Adumim, for the most part, the poskim have stated are clearly not Yerushalayim. Although I've heard that in some parts of Ma'ale Adumim where you can clearly see the old city, that they read the Megillah on both days. So Givat Ze'ev is a little further to the west, and it really can't see Yerushalayim because it's lower down. But say Har Nof, parts of Ramot I've heard, there's been questions. So the Gemara talks about this. How do you define this? Amar Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi krach v'kol hasamuch lo v'kol hanira imo. So he said it's a city and anything adjacent to it and anything that can be seen from it. Nidon kikrach as part of the city. So the Gemara now is going to say that you only need to fulfill one of these conditions. Tana samuch afal pi she'eino nira. It's sufficient that it's adjacent without being able to be seen. And nira afal pi she'eino samuch, and to see it or to be seen by it, even though it's not adjacent. So the Gemara wants to understand how that can happen geographically. It seems peculiar. So Bishlaman Yira Afal Pi She'eino Samuch Mishkach Ela Kedkon Diyatva Berosh Hahar. Okay, we understand clearly that BAYT V'Gan is not Samuch to the old city, but since the old city is on a high point, and BAYT V'Gan is on a high point, you can see the old city from BAYT V'Gan if you're high enough in BAYT V'Gan, right? So we understand that you could have a city that's on a mountaintop and it can see things that are around it even though it's not adjacent to it. But how can you have something that's adjacent to the city and yet you can't see it from the city? So he answers, Amar Rabbi Yirmiyah Yoshevet Benachal, that it's in a very low place. So you can't really see it from the city, but it's adjacent to the city. So, for example, just outside the old city walls in Gei Beit Ninom, it's a very low part of Yerushalayim. So it's possible that you might not be able to see a structure that's there from the old city because you'd be looking over it, but it's right outside the walls, right? So that's all that he said about it. As I said, there's a significant amount of Torah that's been written on it in the last 25 years, because as new neighborhoods get added to Yerushalayim, this issue comes up all the time, right? So now we're going to talk about something else. We're going to talk about, what about a city that initially was a city and then it became a smaller place and the wall disappeared and it wasn't a walled city anymore. So is that still considered to be a city, or is it now a village? So he says, Amar Rabbi Yirmiyah V'amar Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi, sorry, first wide line, Krach sheyashav u'lasof hukaf nidon kikfar. So first of all, he talks about a situation where initially they built the city, and only later did they build a wall, so it's treated as a village, as an unwalled city. Okay? Amaitama, how do you know that? Because it says, V'ish kim kor beit moshav ir choma, shukaf, ulevasof yashav, velosh yashav ulesof hukaf. Because the Torah has specific laws about someone who sells a house in a city, a walled city, as opposed to someone who sells a house in an unwalled city, in terms of what your redemption period is. So since it defines it as a Beit Moshav Ir Choma, it's mashma that the wall was there and then they put the houses there, but not the other way around, that the houses were first and the wall came later. And similarly, V'amar Raizel, Krach she'en bo asara batlanim nidon kikfar. That if you have a city that has less than 10 people who were retired and study full time, then that's considered to be a village. My kamash malan, why is he telling me this? Tanina, we've learned this already. We've learned this definition. Ezoi ir gdola, what do we consider to be a large city? Kol sheyesh ba'asara batlanim, and any city that has 10 retired people that can devote their time to Torah study. Pachot mikan, hareze kvar. Without that, that's considered a kvar. So we know this definition. Why is he telling us it over again? So he answers, Krach itztrich le afagav de miklai le me'alma. That what he wanted to tell us is the case of a city where the Mishnah is talking about a town that even though there's many visitors from out of town that are retired people and they can stay and learn in town, that it's still not considered to be a city unless there's 10 local people that are studying full time. And finally, V'amar Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi, Krach shecharev ulevasof yashav niton kikrach. So he says that if you have a walled city that was destroyed and then subsequently it was rebuilt, it's still treated as a walled city. So say Yerushalayim, even though Yerushalayim, the walls have been destroyed many times, is still considered Yerushalayim. So my charev, what does he mean by destroyed? Ilema charbu chomotav yashav in lo yashav lo. So you're saying that it means that the wall was really destroyed? Then you're saying that only if it was subsequently settled, the walls were rebuilt, that it becomes a walled city again, but if it was not rebuilt, that it's not a walled city? But that's not true. V'atanya Rabbi Yossi Eliezer bar Yossi Omer Asher lo choma. So the Torah writes Asher lo choma, it spells it Lamed Vav Aleph. So the Ktiv is Lamed Vav Aleph, like lo, missing. And yet we read it in the Torah lo as Lamed Vav, that it does have a wall, right? This is talking about, once again, about the redemption. So the Torah is hinting to us that if there was a walled city and the wall was destroyed, even though there is no wall at the present moment, that it's still considered to be a city. So we see that by Torah law, even if the wall is never rebuilt, that it's still considered to be a walled city. Like today's walls in Yerushalayim are not in the same place as the walls from, say, BAYT Sheni, right? Certainly not in the same place as the walls from BAYT Rishon, but yet we still consider Jerusalem and all of Jerusalem to be a walled city, right? So, Elamai Charev, meaning Shecharev mi'asara batlanim. What he means is that the city lost its 10 batlanim, and then eventually they had enough people back again.
It's late.
It is late. Okay, thank you everybody.